Hi, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. I'm back after a 1 week hiatus. I appreciate you all being patient with me. My production crew, which is my son-in-law Eric and my daughter Brianna, were on vacation, as they should do on occasion. And so we didn't tape last week, but we're back, and this is, as we've said before, it's a continuation of a Sunday school lesson that we're putting on YouTube so that you all can do this at your leisure, at your own pace. And we have done in the New Testament before. We're working our way through the Old Testament. We're up into the 2nd Samuel, and this is about David and his family. It's a very interesting part of the history of David, and it's probably the most well-known stories because of the romantic aspects of the David stories, other than the battle with Goliath, and it's fascinating. It shows his great strength and it shows his great weakness. Now, we all have strengths and weaknesses. And in this situation, David's family and personal relationships become his biggest problem. Not his administrative skill or his military skill or other things like that. It's his family and personal relationships that almost bring him to grief. Another point I've made before, that he clearly had a court historian to write these things down in the enormous detail that you'll find. You find conversations in here and accounts of what people said, and you can get that only if they told somebody. So by this time, Hebrew was in its early written form called Proto-Hebrew. They found small writings on pottery and on stone things. So there's evidence of written Hebrew at this point, about 1000 BC. And so this has apparently allowed the detailed stories to survive and be incorporated into these books when this was all blended together 500 years later in the Babylonian exile. And this is an interesting part of King David. The first time I presented this kind of material was way back at the Indian-run United Methodist Church. And my first class, I got to this point and I described King David as the greatest king in Israelite history, a true lover of the Lord. Remember how he celebrated bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem in the last lesson. An adulterer, a murderer. The class was kind of shocked at my candor. Well, when I told this the next week to my patient, who was a National Baptist, very conservative Baptist pastor, he just laughed at the shock of the class, because it's right there in the text. You read it. It describes his adulterous affair. It describes how he gets her husband murdered. And so it's very interesting. It's also a good point that God can use the strangest people. Moses had been a murderer. He murdered the Egyptians one of the Egyptians prior to the Exodus. Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul, the greatest New Testament figure outside of Jesus, was an accomplice to murder when he held the cloaks while they stoned Stephen to death, the first martyr. And they were not allowed to stone people to death in the Roman Empire. So God can use even people with great evil in his purposes. So let's put this into the historical context. David has bested his enemies. He has defeated Saul and Saul's army. Saul was killed in battle with the Philistines, not by David, and then he defeated Saul's sole surviving son, Ishbaal, in battle, and Ishbaal was killed by other people, so he's gone. He's defeated the Philistines, basically driven them back to the coast, and they're much less of a threat than they were before. He's conquered a lot of the neighboring kingdoms, Edom to the southeast, Moab due east across from Jericho, across the Jordan, Ammon up to the northeast, where the capital of Ammon, Jordan, is now. And he's driven everybody back, and he has this mid-sized empire. Now, God had given him the situation where all the other previous empires in the Middle East had been weakened or destroyed. The Hittites were gone. The Assyrians had not come up. Babylonia had not come up. Egypt was in all kinds of crisis. The Mycenaean kingdoms were all gone. So they had this perfect time frame for this great kingdom. He conquered Jerusalem, put his capital there, and he was riding high and doing well. All his enemies were vanquished, etc. But the problem becomes his personal behavior and his family. The personal behavior shows up in this very good account where it describes how he's arisen from his period of resting. Usually they would, in these hot climates, take a mid-afternoon nap after their mid-afternoon meal, and he's up walking around the roof of the palace in that evening, and he sees Bathsheba bathing herself. I've always read this account. I thought, boy, it sure sounds to me like she wanted him to see her. She's described as very beautiful. She's out there bathing herself. He's up there watching her from the roof. Boy, that sounds like a setup if I ever heard it. And he asks his people, who is this beautiful woman? And they said, it's Bathsheba. She's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, Uriah the Hittite is clearly not a Hebrew person. He's described as Hittite, which would put him from up in the north. And he's a professional soldier, mercenary, fighter in David's army. He's a hired professional soldier. And so David says, oh, okay. And he says, well, go get this woman for me. So they do, and he has sex with her. And a little bit later, she sends him a message, I'm pregnant. Well, her husband has been away on a military campaign all along. So David clearly is thinking, whoops, how am I going to cover myself here? So he sends a message to his commander, Joab. Joab is very, very loyal, ferocious David supporting general, very loyal to David. That's a very valuable thing in general. And he sends Uriah down, and David says, well, welcome back, and how are things at the battle, and blah, blah, blah. And they talk, go on home. Trying to send him to his wife so that it would appear that he was the father of this child. But Uriah doesn't go to his house. He sleeps in the guardhouse outside the palace. And you wonder why. Well, many tribal warrior societies have very strict prohibitions on sexual activity during the time of warfare. That sexual activity could either contaminate you, some groups felt that, or it could drain your energies. Some people felt that. So certain tribal groups have very strong prohibitions on not engaging in sexual activity while you're doing battle. That's not part of Western culture, but the Native American population had that prohibition, and they did not sexually assault the women when they ran over, conquered their enemies. They killed them or took them as slaves or concubines, but they wouldn't rape them on the battlefield. And it's not a question of Western military culture that sexual assault of women captives in European and Western thing is very common. It was a huge issue in our revolution. The beginning of the revolution, that John Adams said that it was about a third the people were patriots, a third were neutral, and a third were pro-British. But the British had terrible time with their soldiers. They would rape any woman they could get their hands on, and the Hessian professional mercenaries came over and would steal everything from everybody, even if you were a loyalist to the British. So you can see along the way, this is not how you take care of the hearts and minds of your opponents. You turn the whole country against them by the end of the war. Everybody was happy to get rid of them. So sexual assault is a real issue, but Uriah was an adherent of the thing that you did not do this, engage in sexual activity while you were in the campaign. So he sleeps at the guardhouse, and David finds this out the next day, that he hadn't gone down to his house. So he has a party for him, and he gets him drunk and says, I'll go on down to your house. And Uriah spends the night at the guardhouse again. And David's thinking, what am I going to do? Here's this guy who's being loyal to his code as a warrior, and I've gotten his wife pregnant. How am I going to cover this? And I don't know. So he sends him back to the army. Then he sends a message privately to Joab, his commander, basically telling him, put Uriah out in front and attack the city where you're besieging it, and then pull back, because Joab knows if you go up too close, they're going to sally forth from the walls and attack you. So he does what David says. He goes up front and puts Uriah in the lead, and then pulls back and basically abandons him, and Uriah, along with other people, gets killed. So he sends a message back to David that Uriah has gotten killed, and David brings Bathsheba into his household and marries her. Now, he has a bunch of other wives and a bunch of concubines. The last thing he needs is another person in his household, but he doesn't know that, or he can't act on that. And so he marries her. She becomes one of his wives, and he has many. And he is confronted by Nathan the prophet. This is the first of the individual prophets you see emerge that we're going to study for the next couple months as we work our way through the writings of and the teachings of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, various prophets, Amos, Hosea, and Micah, and a variety of people. This is the first one who really emerges as a significant independent prophet. Terms used on a few other people scattering there. And the man named Nathan. And Nathan comes to David and confronts him and tells them this story about this rich man who has everything and all these flocks and all that. A neighboring has a poor man who has only one little sheep. And the rich man has a guest coming, and he doesn't want to use one of his own, the flock that he's got. So he steals the poor man's one sheep and slaughters that for the meal. And David is outraged, and he says, "Tell me who this is, and I'll have his head." And Nathan says, "It's you, sire." I thought, boy, now that's courage. To be able to say that to this king who'd had his enemies killed off, etc. But he does. And David goes, "Oh." And he knows he's done it. He knows he's sinned. So because he not only took this guy's wife, he got the guy killed so that he can have her in addition. So when I described him in that class many, many years ago as an adulterer and murderer, that's true. And so David repents. And Nathan tells him, now, David says, "I shouldn't have done this terrible thing to do." And he knew he shouldn't have done it. He knew it from the beginning he shouldn't do it. They had very strict prohibitions against adultery at that time. Now, adultery has always been defined by the culture, as opposed to David having multiple wives was not considered adultery. But David going to bed with someone else's wife, that was adultery, both for him and for her. But having multiple wives was not at the time. It is now, but that's different. And so, so Nathan tells him, "Okay, God's not going to kill you for this, but the child is not going to live. You're going to be punished by this." So the child is born, and it's ill in some fashion. There's no description. We don't really know. And David is constantly fasting and wearing sackcloth and all the mourning progressions that you do at that time, trying to show his repentance, because he truly did repent. We all sin. Hopefully not all of us are murderers or adulterers, but we're all sinners, that's for sure. And and finally, after a week, the child dies, and David recovers and goes back to his normal life. And Bathsheba has another child who becomes Solomon, who was the king who succeeds him over time. Now you digress into a different account, and you'll see where David's family really becomes an enormous burden on him. Remember, as a monarch in those days, the king in those days, you had lots of threats of people wanting to take away your throne. Now, one of them was your generals. Now, David's general, Joab, was extremely loyal and never made any hint at doing anything but supporting David against his foreign and domestic enemies. But your other threat were your male relatives, your brothers, your sons, your nephews. They could try to take over and usurp you, often killing you along the way. So you had to be worried about them. Well, the problem now erupts inside his family. He has an eldest son, Amnon, and Amnon falls in love with his half-sister, Tamar. Tamar apparently is very beautiful. David had his unmarried daughters dressed very well, so they was very attractively written, and his heart is pining for this woman. What am I going to do? And one of his friends tells him, who's like a cousin, tells him, well, tell her, have them say you're ill and request that she come and nurture you, provide you with food and all that. And then you've got her. And so he does that. He pretends to be ill, takes to his sick bed and says, have her come take care of me. And she comes, he has her shut the door, and then he grabs her and tries to seduce her, and she's unwilling. You just can't do this. Why don't you talk to her father? He can give me to you, blah, blah, blah. And Amnon's not going to be turned down, and he rapes her. Now, this is a really serious crime to sexually assault your half-sister, because she's a half-sister. They share the same father. So you've got all the violations in the family and the violations of all the sexual prohibitions inside close relations. Remember, the Hebrews at this time, as they are now, are a nation of laws, great laws on purity and these types of strictly behavior. And so he's violating all these rules. And as after this happens, she's extremely upset, of course, that's natural. And then he turns on her, and all this love becomes hatred instead. And he throws her out, tells her terrible and all this. Clearly, the hatred is self-hatred. You know, that if you he doesn't switch from loving her to hating her, right? But who does he really hate? He hates himself for having done this. Great sermon I heard back in Montreat, North Carolina, in the 1970s. One of the few sermons I remember in my life. The preacher man named Tom Skinner had a great point. When Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, he didn't say, love your neighbor instead of yourself. Because his point was, if you don't love yourself first, your neighbor better look out. So a lot of the bad behavior I've seen in life is people that hate themselves. And they know they're this and that and all these problems. And it makes them much, much worse to anybody around us. So anyway, now he hates her from all this self-hatred. And her full brother, Absalom, is extremely upset with this. And David's extremely upset. But David didn't know what to do. David could not handle his kids. He should have exiled him, sent him away, punished him in some severe way. He does nothing. He just couldn't stand up to his kids. Finally, after a couple years, the brother Absalom decides to set up a situation to get Amnon killed. So he has a banquet in a different part of the area, and he invites all of David's sons, and it sounds like there's a whole bunch of them, to come to this banquet. The last thing David needed were more children, that's for sure. And at this banquet, he gives a signal, and certain of his henchmen attack Amnon and kill him right there. The other sons get away. They jump on their mules and ride off. And I read that, and I thought, that's an odd thing for princes to be riding mules, having grown up riding horses. And I've ridden mules. Mules are very steady. They use them to go down into the Grand Canyon and back up on the narrow trails. They're very steady, but they're slow. They don't run as well as horses. They're not as agile, not as mobile. Strange that the child of the king, the princesses, would be riding mules, but that's what it says. And they escape, and they go on back to Jerusalem, and that Absalom knows he's in trouble because he got his brother killed, or he killed his brother. So he flees to a place called Geshur. Now, Geshur is up where the Golan Heights is now. If you remember the old Israel-Syrian border north of the Sea of Galilee, was these heights called the Golan Heights, and Israelis took them in 1967. They're holding on to them, and it remains a point of great friction between Israel and Syria. So he goes up there. It's a separate kingdom, and he stays there for 3 years. And Joab, the general, arranges for David to let him come back in. It's an odd story. I don't completely understand. Joab has an elderly widow, and he concocts this story for her to tell David to induce David to feel sympathetic for Absalom and be willing to welcome him back. And so he does. He welcomes him back. So Absalom comes and he returns, and David's happy to see him and all that. But he starts to try to undermine his father. For the next several years, he has this kind of low-level subterfuge where he would set himself up outside of Jerusalem to the north, and if people are coming down to plead their case with David, you help me with this and help me with that, you know, my neighbor's stealing my field or something like that, he would act like he's the king and tell him, you do this and you do that, and this is use his own judgment as if he's king. After 4 years of this, he decided that he's able to get the northern tribes of Israel to proclaim him king. Remember, this was always a tempestuous relationship. David's tribe, the tribe of Judah, is about 40% of all the Hebrew population. The small tribe of Benjamin, Saul's tribe, often was allied with Judah. They were right next to it. But the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, felt a lot of resentment of being ruled by this larger tribe. And this is typical of these kind of cultures, that you have these tensions inside these kingdoms. And so Absalom proclaims himself king of Israel, and they support him. And David realizes he's got a true rebellion on his hand here, led by his son. And so he flees, takes off from Jerusalem. Now, David's Jerusalem is very small. It's on this promontory south of where the Temple Mount is now. And he starts to make his plans, and he decides how to flee, and he flees. He decides to leave the Ark of the Covenant behind. He doesn't want to take the effort of taking that along with him, and he talks to the priests and basically enlists them in supporting him and keeping an eye on things. He turns his palace over to 10 of his concubines, and then he has a man that he places in Jerusalem to I can't find the person's name, to keep an eye on things and to use his influence to get Absalom to be reasonable. And his name is Hushai. And Hushai basically acts as David's agent. Sorry, I got confused there a little bit. I'm getting old here. And to stay behind and influence Absalom not to be too tough on David, and allow David to escape. And Hushai does that. He talks Absalom out of it. And then in one of the great indignities of this era, Absalom goes and has sex with David's concubines and stayed behind. Now, this violates all kinds of purity laws that these people have, because you're bedding with your father's women, and that's just a total sin on his part in these people with purity laws. So David is fleeing to the east, heading for Jericho and the Jordan River, and his former person that he had taken care of, Meribel, had been the son of David's friend Jonathan. Jonathan was the oldest son of King Saul. Meribel was the only surviving son of Jonathan. He's therefore next in line if the Saul line was to be restored. He had 2 crippled feet, probably 2 club feet. And David had taken him in, kept him in the royal palace, allowed him to eat table with them. One was monitoring a promise that he had made to Jonathan to take care of his descendants, and also kept him under lock and key, would keep an eye on him. At first chance Meribel gets, he shows his gratitude to David's kindness by betraying him, joining forces with Absalom, hoping that he's going to get restored to the crown. Now, that's kind of naive. Absalom's not going to throw his father out and give the crown to this other guy, but it shows Meribel would, one of those people who'll betray you in a flash. But remember, they'll also betray you back. Okay, they'll betray themselves to you and then say it was against you. So you got to remember that one. So he tries to join up with him. And David finds this out, and he's really angry. He's told this by Ziba. Ziba was the lady who had taken care of Meribel when he was a child, and it brought him to David, and had taken care of him. And David says, "You can have all, you and your family," he says to Ziba, "can have all of Meribel's estates. I'm taking his land away from you. I'm going to reward you for your loyalty." And so David's fleeing to the east. Absalom's bedding down with David's concubines. And David crosses in the Jordan into Moab, across the river. And along the way, there's this guy named Shimei who's standing up there shouting curses at David. It's an interesting story. I mean, and some of David's warriors says, "Let's go kill this guy." And David said, "Don't worry about it. It's just words. Forget about it. Let's get out of here. Let's keep moving. We have a real struggle, and it's not with him. The real struggle is with Absalom and his troops." So they ignore him and leave him. David gets across the Jordan. He gets himself organized. He gets his army together. Joab comes along and gets the army together, and they have a big battle, and they defeat Absalom's army. And after the defeat, Absalom is fleeing, and it's an interesting story. And he gets, quote, hung up in a tree. They said by his hair getting caught in the branches of the tree, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And then Joab and the army come along and find him there, and they kill him. Now, I personally don't think that's what happened. I think Joab and his men caught Absalom, and they were really angry with it. Here's the king's son, but trying to betray the king, trying to kill them all. I think they put him up there, hang him up in the tree, and use him for target practice. they're going to kill him and they're going to make him suffer. That's what my opinion is. That's just an opinion. The account says he gets hung up in the tree by his hair, which seems a little bit defying common sense. But so anyway, they up there and they kill him. And David, Joab goes back and tells David, "You've won. You won the battle. Absalom is dead." And all David could do is mourn for his son. Oh my gosh, Absalom is dead. I understand now you could do this. This is what you think emotionally. Two of his sons are dead. One of them's killed by the other, and the other one's killed by his army commander. And David is just kind of thunderstruck with grief. And Joab tells him, "Hey, shape up here. Toughen up. You got to take control of this situation. You can't just be moping around here. You've got to be strong and be in command." And so David toughens up and goes back and is starting to return to Jerusalem. They're going by the Shimei guy who was cursing David on the way out. He's not cursing him on the way back because David's won. And David just ignore him. Just, it's just words. Let it go. So he comes back to Jerusalem. And guess who shows up trying to betray Absalom's people? Of course, is Meribel, the grandson of Saul, the son of David's friend, Jonathan. He's suddenly back to restore himself to David's good graces. This is very interesting because David honors his promise to Jonathan. He promised Jonathan, before Jonathan died, that he would be loyal and take care of Jonathan's children, which he does. So he brings this traitor back into his household and lets him return to his place at the table. He didn't trust him to begin with, and he certainly don't trust him now. But this way, you can keep an eye on him. If he's living in your house, you can have your people watch him. So he comes back and sucks up, and David lets him in. I think it's actually pretty smart of David. He really doesn't want to go killing Saul's family personally. So David allows him to come back in. Now, the 10 concubines that Absalom had bedded down with, those are considered defiled, that they had become damaged by having sexual relations with the son of the person to whom they were linked. This violates all these kind of laws, and so they're not punished, but they're isolated, and they become their own little 10-person group, and they just live in isolation. And that's their fate. They had been defiled by Absalom. Then there's another revolt from the north, and this is the guy named Sheba, and he starts a revolt along the same lines, that the northern tribes want to revolt again against David. And there's another battle, and Joab defeats them again. Joab is a really important guy, and the commander of Sheba's forces, the general in charge, was a man named Amasa. Joab locates him and basically comes up to him. If you remember in the last episode, there was a son of Saul named Ishbaal who had revolted against David, attacked David, and his general was a man named Abner, and Joab had personally dispatched Abner, inviting him, "Come around the corner of the building, I want to talk to you," and knifes him in the gut and kills him. Well, he does the same thing to Amasa. He personally kills him. Joab is not a man to mess with. This is not a kind of man I would have messed with. I'd have said, sure. If he said, "Come around the building with me," I said, "No way. I'll stay out here." So he killed him again, personally dispatching the general in revolt against David. A very loyal person, and he leads that revolt. So the guy who was the figurehead, the man named Sheba, he takes off because they've lost, and he goes to a city. I forget the city's name. Joab's going to go up there and finish this one by besieging the city, and they're about to either get over the walls with a ramp or breach the walls, dig them, and they'll fall over and get in the city. And this lady shouts down at him from, "What do you want?" Joab shouts back, "Hey, we want Sheba. And basically, we'll leave you all alone if you give us Sheba." Seems like an easy deal to me, for the city, just let him go. Well, they do a little bit more than that. They whack his head off and throw his head over to Joab, and Joab knows, A, he's dead, you can't live without your head, and B, I'll leave you all alone. And he leaves them alone, doesn't have to destroy the city, turns around and goes back to David. And so, after all of this, David reigns supreme. But it's a very interesting lesson, because when you get to be that kind of powerful in these despotic kind of situations, your personal weaknesses are much more of a challenge than your enemies. His enemies were weak. His children were nothing but trouble. His own personal lusts and desires did nothing but trouble for him. So it's a very interesting story about the great strength of this person as a political leader, the great weakness that he had, even though he was a true lover of the Lord. So what I said about him at that lesson many years ago remains true. A greatest king, a lover of the Lord, adulterer, murderer. It all remains in there. So we'll stop here. The next reading will go to just the benign end of David and the King Solomon era, as about the kingdoms are about to split. So if you want reading for next week, it's 1 Kings. We finished 2 Samuel now. Chapter 1 through chapter 7, verse 14. Then chapter 8, verses 1 through 29. Then chapter 10 and chapter 11. This is basically Solomon also remains supreme, and he has undertakes the building of the temple and the building of the great palace. He's able to use the money produced by this kingdom that his father had created. The kingdom does not survive after Solomon's gone. It splits in two, but Solomon is able to reign supreme for this time. This is Dr. Guthrie. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.